The lights of the grand ballroom sparkled like diamonds, their glow reflecting off the marble floors and expensive chandeliers. The charity gala was in full swing, and the room was filled with the hum of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. People in designer suits and glittering gowns moved gracefully through the space, their smiles wide and their eyes bright. This wasn't just another charity event, it was the event of the year, and everyone wanted to be a part of it. Among the sea of well-dressed guests was Sandra, trying her best to stay in the background. She had always been one to enjoy a quiet evening, and tonight was no different. She wasn't used to all the attention that usually came with being in the spotlight, so she chose to sit off to the side, observing the crowd as they mingled and laughed. A few people noticed her and smiled, but for the most part she was left alone. Sandra liked it that way. After all, this night wasn't about her. It was about the cause they were supporting. Still, it wasn't easy being in a room full of so many familiar faces, most of whom seemed like they had everything in life: wealth, success, and influence. Sandra had come for one reason: to support the charity. She wasn't here for the glitz or the glamour. But as she sat in the quiet corner of the room, sipping her drink and watching the crowd, she couldn't help but overhear a group of women near the center of the ballroom. Their voices were high-pitched and full of laughter, but the words were cutting. "Did you see Sandra's latest movie? I mean, honestly, it was so plain. I don't know why she keeps getting roles like that," one of the women said, her voice dripping with a tone of superiority. Another woman joined in. "Exactly. She was never the best actress, but at least she was cute in her earlier films now. I can't even remember the last time she was actually relevant." Sandra felt a sharp sting, though she tried to brush it off. She had heard worse, especially when she first came into the industry. But something about hearing it tonight at this event, in front of so many people she knew, felt different. The women continued, unaware that Sandra was just a few feet away, trying her best to keep her distance. They didn't seem to care that they were being loud, or that their words carried across the room. Their conversation turned into gossip, with one of the women commenting on how Sandra had let herself go. She was too down-to-earth for their tastes, not glamorous enough for the high society world they so proudly inhabited. She used to be so much more, didn't she? Now she just seems like she's trying too hard to fit in, the woman said, her voice filled with judgment. Sandra felt her face grow hot. She had been through her fair share of criticism, but hearing it in such an open and dismissive way made her feel small. She thought about standing up and leaving the event. Maybe it was better to just go. But then she stopped herself. No, she wouldn't let them win. Sandra wasn't the type to back down, not even when people like this thought they could pick her apart. But the sting didn't go away. It lingered in the air, heavy and hard to ignore. The women continued their conversation, blissfully unaware of Sandra sitting right behind them. They laughed and sipped their drinks, completely oblivious to the fact that their target was only a few steps away. Sandra tried to focus on the rest of the evening, on the faces of the guests who were enjoying themselves, but it was hard to push away the words that kept echoing in her mind. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, she heard the voice of someone she didn't expect: Keanu Reeves. Sandra had known him for years, ever since they worked together on a film. He was sitting not too far from her, quietly observing the event. Keanu had a way of blending into any crowd. He wasn't interested in the spotlight. He preferred to stay out of it, and he was always polite but distant when it came to these kinds of events. Tonight was no different. Keanu was seated in the corner, casually dressed in a black suit that didn't seem as extravagant as most of the others in the room. His presence was calm and grounded, a sharp contrast to the flashy, attention-grabbing guests around them. Keanu caught Sandra's eye from across the room, and he gave her a small, knowing smile. Sandra's heart lightened at the sight of him. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough to comfort her. They had been through a lot together, and she knew she could always rely on him when things got tough. But tonight, it wasn't about her or him. It was about the people around them, people like the women who had been gossiping. The truth was, Sandra had spent much of her career in the public eye. She had been the subject of praise, and she had also been the subject of ridicule, but at this moment she felt something different. She felt a deep sense of isolation. She had spent so much of her life trying to live up to other people's expectations Tonight she realized how much she had let the opinions of others shape the way she viewed herself. Keanu continued to watch her from across the room, his gaze warm but distant, as if he could sense her discomfort. After a few moments, he stood up and walked over to her, his footsteps soft against the marble floor. He had never been one to make a scene, but he could tell that Sandra was feeling a little out of place. "Are you all right?" Keanu asked gently, sitting down beside her. His presence was like a quiet anchor in a storm. Sandra looked at him and smiled, grateful for the simplicity of his question. She didn't want to admit how much the gossip had bothered her, but there was something comforting about being able to talk to him. "I'm fine," she said with a shrug, but her voice wavered just slightly. "Just, people have their opinions. It's not a big deal." Keanu raised an eyebrow but didn't push her. He knew better than to force someone to talk when they weren't ready. Instead, he just nodded, his calm energy helping to ease her anxiety. "You know," Keanu said, his tone light, "people always think they know the truth, but most of the time they have no idea what's really going on." Sandra chuckled softly. "Yeah, I guess that's true. They think they can see everything, but they don't know half of it." They sat in silence for a while, enjoying the quiet of each other's company. Outside, the gala continued with all its glitz and glamour, but for Sandra and Keanu it felt like the world had paused for just a moment. They didn't need to be part of the show. They didn't need to be the center of attention. They were fine just being themselves away from the spotlight, and as they sat there, Sandra couldn't help but feel a little bit stronger. Maybe it wasn't so important to please everyone. Maybe the only thing that truly mattered was staying true to herself, and finding people who would do the same. But the night was far from over, and as the minutes passed, Sandra knew that the situation with the group of women was only just beginning. As Sandra and Keanu sat in the corner, sharing a quiet moment away from the hustle of the gala, the scene around them continued without pause. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the gentle hum of conversations. It was all part of the grand performance. The ballroom had become a stage, and everyone in it was either an actor or an audience. But Sandra and Keanu weren't interested in that show. They were more content to observe from the sidelines, enjoying each other's company without the need to play any part in the spectacle. Yet, while they were lost in their own little world, the women from earlier were still nearby, talking amongst themselves. They had no idea that Keanu was listening to every word. He had been sitting in the corner of the room for a while now, blending in with the background as he so often did. Keanu wasn't the type to attract attention, even though he easily could. The truth was, he didn't want to be seen as some unattainable star. He preferred the quiet life, where he could move through the world unnoticed without the pressure that came with being one of the most famous actors in the world. But tonight was different. Tonight he was hearing things he hadn't expected. Sandra was his friend, and hearing people mock her in such a casual, cruel way made his stomach churn. Keanu wasn't used to being in the middle of social scenes like this one, and he certainly didn't enjoy hearing the whispers that floated around him. His quiet demeanor was often mistaken for indifference, but that couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, Keanu cared deeply about the people in his life, especially Sandra. And tonight, it was clear that the atmosphere wasn't as glamorous as it seemed. While Keanu listened to the women's conversation from his corner, he couldn't help but feel a bit of a twist in his gut. Sandra had always been kind and genuine, never playing the games that others in Hollywood seem so eager to play. She wasn't part of the in crowd, and that made her stand out in a way that some people found unappealing. But to Keanu, that was what made her special. He couldn't understand why anyone would feel the need to tear her down when all she ever did was try to be herself. He shifted slightly in his chair, trying to keep his presence unnoticed by the group of women, who were still deep in their conversation. They were talking about Sandra's career, analyzing her every move as though she were a character in a film they were reviewing. One woman in particular seemed to be leading the conversation. She spoke loudly, making sure everyone could hear her. "Honestly, I just don't get it," the woman said, her voice dripping with judgment. Sandra was amazing when she started out. Everyone loved her. But now, it's like she's just clinging to her past. "I don't know why people still consider her such a big deal." Her friends nodded in agreement, murmuring their own opinions on Sandra's career, her public image, and her personal choices. The group seemed to be enjoying their gossip, as if it were some sort of game to tear down someone who wasn't there to defend herself. Sandra had always been the kind of person who didn't engage in public drama, and she was known for keeping her private life as quiet as possible. But that was part of the problem for people like these women. They didn't understand it. They couldn't wrap their heads around someone who was successful and yet didn't fit into the mold they wanted to put them in. They expected celebrities to be larger than life, to behave according to the rules of a world they didn't truly belong to. But Sandra was different. She wasn't about the glitz or the glamorous life. She was about sincerity and authenticity, two qualities that were becoming increasingly rare in the Hollywood world. As the women continued to talk, Keanu's discomfort grew. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to stand up and confront them, but he knew that wasn't the best way to handle the situation. Sandra was a strong woman, and if she wanted to address it herself, he would support her. But the more he heard, the more he realized how misguided these women were. They thought they understood the world Sandra inhabited, but in reality, they were out of touch with what truly mattered. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, lost in his own thoughts, until he saw Sandra stand up. She wasn't going to let it slide. He could tell by the way she carried herself. There was a calm confidence in her movements, as if she was ready to face whatever came her way. Sandra walked over to the women's table, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The women, still caught up in their conversation, didn't notice her at first, but when she reached their table, they fell silent. Sandra was known for her ability to make an entrance even without trying. She had that sort of quiet grace that commanded attention without demanding it. One of the women blinked, her eyes widening in surprise as she looked up at Sandra. The others followed her gaze, their faces shifting from casual indifference to surprise. They clearly hadn't expected Sandra to be so close, much less to confront them. "Excuse me," Sandra said with a small, polite smile. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." The women froze. It was one thing to gossip behind someone's back. It was another thing entirely to have the person you were talking about standing in front of you, listening to every word. Sandra's tone was calm, but there was a steeliness to it that made the women uncomfortable. She wasn't angry, but her presence was enough to make them realize how wrong they had been. She didn't need to shout or make a scene. Her words alone were enough. "I just wanted to say," she continued, "that it's always interesting to hear how people perceive others from a distance. But what you may not realize is that there's a lot more to a person than what's seen on the surface." The women shifted in their seats, each one trying to find the right thing to say, but none of them could come up with anything. Sandra had turned the tables on them in a way that left them speechless. They had expected her to be defensive, or worse, to let the criticism slide. But instead, she had confronted them with nothing more than her own quiet confidence. Sandra gave them a moment to process, then added, "I'm sure you didn't mean any harm, but I think it's important to remember that we're all people, and we all deserve respect, no matter how much or how little you know about someone." The women glanced at one another, clearly unsure how to respond. They had underestimated Sandra, and now they were realizing just how out of touch they were. It wasn't just that Sandra was famous, it was that she was real. She wasn't going to let them belittle her or anyone else without standing up for herself, and that was something they hadn't expected. Keanu, still watching from his corner, felt a surge of pride. Sandra was handling this with grace, but also with power. She wasn't letting their words define her, and she wasn't backing down. The silence between them hung in the air for a moment longer, before one of the women cleared her throat. "We didn't mean to offend you," she said, her voice tentative. "We were just—" Sandra smiled, cutting her off with a gentle but firm gesture. "I know. It's easy to say things without thinking, but I just wanted to remind you that words matter." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving the women to stew in the realization of what they had done. She didn't need to say anything more. She had made her point. Keanu smiled to himself as he watched Sandra walk back to her seat. He had always admired her strength, but tonight, he was in awe of her ability to handle the situation with such poise. She had managed to turn an uncomfortable moment into a lesson, and in doing so, she had made them all think about the power of their words. Sandra sat down beside him again, her expression calm. "Well, that was fun," she said, her voice light. "You know, I wasn't sure if they were going to apologize, but I guess they realized they couldn't keep talking like that." Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "You handled that like a pro." Sandra smiled, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, and sometimes people need to be reminded of that. As Sandra and Keanu sat back down, the weight of the moment seemed to lift. Sandra had confronted the women directly, and in her own calm, collected way had made it clear that their words had consequences. Keanu could see the relief in her eyes, but there was also a quiet satisfaction. She didn't need to shout or make a scene. She had stood her ground without losing her cool. It was a lesson he knew all too well, but tonight, seeing her in action, reminded him just how much strength she carried. Even in the most difficult moments, the conversation at their table shifted as Sandra and Keanu began talking about other things. They spoke of memories from past film sets, shared funny stories about mutual friends, and even joked about the absurdity of the evening. For a while, it was easy to forget the tension that had hung in the air just moments before. The room was still filled with laughter and chatter, and the guests around them continued to enjoy the evening. But something had changed in the atmosphere. People were beginning to take notice. The women who had been gossiping about Sandra had been left speechless after the confrontation. They didn't know how to react, and they certainly didn't know how to apologize. It was clear to them now that they had underestimated Sandra, and worse, they had underestimated her power to handle such situations. They had expected a different response, something more fitting with the idea of a celebrity they could dismiss. Instead, they had encountered someone who didn't fit their narrow view of the world. It wasn't long before whispers began to ripple through the ballroom. Some guests who had overheard the conversation were now sharing it with others, and before long it became the evening's topic of conversation. "Did you see what just happened?" One woman asked another in a hushed voice. "Sandra Bullock just called out those women for their gossip. And she did it so calmly, like she was teaching them a lesson without even trying." Keanu could sense the shift. He had seen this happen before. How people would start to look at you differently once they realized you weren't going to take their nonsense. But Sandra didn't need the validation of others. She didn't care what anyone thought of her actions. She had made her point, and that was enough. But as the night wore on, Sandra couldn't help but feel the lingering discomfort of being in a room full of people who seemed more interested in tearing each other down than in the charity they had gathered to support. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the cause, far from it, but the whole atmosphere felt out of place. The event was supposed to be about helping others, about making a difference, but instead, it had turned into a spectacle where appearances mattered more than anything else. She looked across the room at Keanu, who had gone back to quietly observing. He was content, as always, to stay out of the spotlight. It was a quality she admired in him. Keanu had always been the type of person who didn't need attention to feel validated. He had his own quiet confidence, and he didn't let the opinions of others sway him. Sandra couldn't say the same for herself, but tonight she felt a little more like him. She had stood up for herself, and it had felt good. There was something powerful about not letting people walk all over you, no matter how much they tried to tear you down. As they talked, Sandra's eyes wandered around the room. She couldn't help but notice the women who had been mocking her earlier. They were still sitting together at their table, and their faces were a mix of embarrassment and discomfort. They had no idea how to move past what had just happened. Some of them were looking at Sandra, but none of them had the courage to approach her and apologize. Instead, they whispered among themselves, their glances quickly darting away when Sandra's eyes met theirs. She wasn't angry with them. She had learned long ago that people who were quick to criticize often had their own insecurities. But that didn't mean their behavior was excusable. Sandra had always believed that if you wanted to have a voice in someone's life, you had to show them respect first. And the women at that table had failed in that respect. But Sandra wasn't about to let it ruin her night. She wasn't going to let their small-mindedness take away from the bigger picture. Keanu must have sensed her thoughts because he turned to her, offering a reassuring smile. "You know," he said, his voice calm and steady, "people like that don't know how to handle someone like you. They think they can control the narrative, but you just proved them wrong." Sandra smiled back, grateful for his support. "Maybe. But it's more about making sure I don't lose sight of what's important. I can't change their opinions, but I can choose how I respond. That's the one thing I have control over." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And you handled it with class. Not everyone would have." Sandra's smile deepened, and she took a sip of her drink, looking out at the crowd once again. I've been in this business long enough to know that there's no point in trying to fight every battle. But when it comes to respecting myself and others, that's non-negotiable. The two of them fell into a comfortable silence, watching the night unfold around them. The band had started playing a softer tune, and some guests had begun to take to the dance floor. The mood in the room had shifted, and though the evening was far from perfect, there was a sense of peace in the air that hadn't been there before. After a while, Keanu leaned over and whispered, "You know, I think I'm going to head out soon. This isn't really my scene." Sandra nodded in understanding. She knew how Keanu felt. These kinds of events, with all their superficiality and self-importance, weren't for everyone. And Keanu had never been the type to stick around when he felt uncomfortable. "I get it," Sandra said softly. "I'm probably not far behind you. I'm glad you were here, though. It's nice having someone I can count on even in moments like this." Keanu smiled, a genuine, warm smile. Always. As Keanu stood up to leave, Sandra couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. She had been surrounded by people all night, but it was Keanu's quiet presence that had made the evening bearable. There was no pretension with him, no need for validation. He was just himself. And that was something Sandra had always admired. She watched as he made his way toward the exit, his tall frame cutting through the crowd effortlessly. As he walked out of the ballroom, Sandra's gaze lingered on the door for a moment before she turned back to her own table. The event was winding down, and the remaining guests seemed more focused on the after-party than the reason they had gathered in the first place. Sandra wasn't sure how much longer she could stand it. She had come to do her part, but now it felt like the evening had lost its meaning. She looked around the room once more, and that's when she saw the women from earlier. They were still sitting at their table, but now they looked different. It was as if they had finally realized the gravity of the situation. One of them caught Sandra's eye and quickly looked away. But this time, Sandra didn't feel the sting of their judgment. Instead, she felt a sense of calm. She had nothing to prove to them, and more importantly, they had nothing to take from her. It was a freeing thought, one that helped her remember why she was here in the first place, not for approval, not for applause, but because she believed in the cause. As she got up to leave, she took a final look around the ballroom, taking in the faces of the people around her. Some of them would forget tonight's events as quickly as they had forgotten the last one, but Sandra wouldn't. She would carry this moment with her. A reminder that standing up for yourself didn't just change the way others saw you, it changed the way you saw yourself. And with that, Sandra walked out of the ballroom, her heart lighter than it had been when she first arrived. The night had settled into a quiet hum when Sandra left the gala. The cool air of the evening greeted her as she stepped outside, away from the flashing lights and the noise of the ballroom. Her mind was clearer now, away from the chaos of the event. She had managed to stay true to herself, and that was all that mattered. She knew there would always be people who tried to tear others down, but she also knew she didn't have to be part of that. As she stepped into her car, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The night was over, but the lesson wasn't. As she sat in the back seat, Sandra glanced out the window at the city lights passing by. Her thoughts drifted back to the moments earlier in the evening. The tension with the women at the table, the way she had confronted them without raising her voice, without losing her composure. It had felt empowering in a way she hadn't expected. She had been through plenty of challenges in her career, but this felt different. It was more than just standing up for herself. It was about choosing not to let others control her narrative. The car turned a corner, and Sandra's thoughts shifted to Keanu. She had always admired his quiet strength, his ability to be present without needing to dominate the space. He was someone who had found peace in being exactly who he was. Sandra, on the other hand, had spent so much of her life trying to please others, to fit into a world that often felt shallow and disconnected from reality. Tonight had been a reminder of how important it was to stay grounded, to remember why she started in the first place. Keanu had always been the type of person who could handle any situation with a level of calm that seemed almost effortless. He had an uncanny ability to deflect attention and focus on what truly mattered. It was a quality Sandra envied, and it was something she had worked hard to adopt over the years. She knew that part of her journey was about finding peace in the chaos, just like Keanu had done. And tonight, for the first time in a long while, she had felt that peace. The car continued through the streets, and Sandra's mind wandered again. She thought about the women at the gala, the ones who had mocked her without even realizing who she was sitting next to. They had been quick to judge, to assume that Sandra was just another celebrity, a figure to gossip about, a target to take down. But they didn't know her. They didn't know what it was like to be in her shoes, to be under the constant scrutiny of the public eye. They didn't understand what it took to keep going, to stay true to yourself when the world around you constantly tried to shape you into something you weren't. Sandra had been in the business for years, but there were still moments when the pressure got to her. There were times when she questioned whether it was all worth it, whether the constant scrutiny, the need to be perfect, was really what she wanted. But then there were moments like tonight, moments where she remembered why she had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't for the fame or the accolades or the red carpet events. It was for the chance to connect with people, to tell stories that mattered, to make a difference in the lives of others. The car slowed as it approached her home, and Sandra felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had faced down the criticism, had stood her ground, and had walked away knowing she had done the right thing. There was a sense of pride in that, even if the rest of the world didn't understand it. She wasn't in this for anyone else's approval. She was in this for herself. As the car pulled into the driveway, Sandra stepped out, stretching her legs as she walked toward the front door. The familiar sound of the key turning in the lock felt comforting, like a small piece of normalcy after an otherwise chaotic evening. Inside, the house was quiet, and Sandra appreciated the stillness. She had spent so much time in the spotlight, and while she had grown used to it, there was something about the quiet moments that reminded her of who she was when no one else was watching. She dropped her purse on the table by the door and kicked off her shoes, grateful to be home. It wasn't that she didn't enjoy the glamour of the events or the excitement of being surrounded by people. There were times when that was energizing, but there were also moments when the noise became too much, when the flashing lights and the constant buzz of conversation made her crave solitude. Tonight had been one of those nights. She didn't need anyone else's validation. She just needed a moment to breathe. As she walked into the living room, Sandra glanced at the photo of her family on the mantel. It was a picture from a simpler time, before the fame, before the pressure of the industry had weighed so heavily on her. It was a reminder of where she came from and of the people who had always been there for her, even when the world around her seemed to shift. She paused for a moment, taking in the image, then made her way to the kitchen. The quiet of the house seemed to fill the space, giving Sandra the time to think. She made herself a cup of tea, enjoying the familiar rhythm of the process. There was something comforting in the small rituals, in the act of caring for herself when the world around her demanded so much. The warmth of the cup in her hands felt like a gentle hug, a reminder that despite everything, she was still in control. As she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed on the counter. Sandra glanced at the screen and a small smile spread across her face. It was a message from Keanu. Made it home safe. Hope you're doing okay after tonight. I think you handled things better than anyone could have. Don't let their opinions get to you. You've got this. Sandra's heart lifted at the words. It was exactly what she needed to hear. She quickly typed a response. Thanks, Keanu, I appreciate it. I'm just glad it's over. But you're right, I won't let them get to me. I've got this. She hit send and leaned back against the counter, letting out a deep breath. The night had been filled with ups and downs, but in the end she had come out stronger. She had proven something to herself, something she hadn't fully realized until now. The opinions of others, the gossip, the judgment, it didn't matter. What mattered was staying true to who she was, no matter what. Sandra knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be more moments of criticism, more challenges to face. But tonight had shown her that she didn't have to face them alone. She had people in her life who supported her, who saw her for who she truly was, and that was all she needed. As the evening wore on, Sandra finished her tea and sat down on the couch. She turned on the television, but her mind was still spinning from the events of the night. It wasn't that she wanted to dwell on the negativity, but it was hard not to think about the way those women had tried to tear her down. It was a reminder of how easy it was for people to make assumptions, to judge someone based on their public persona, rather than their true character. But it was also a reminder of the power she had to change the narrative. The next day would bring a new set of challenges. She knew that. But for now, Sandra allowed herself to relax, to let go of the stress and the pressure. She didn't have to prove anything to anyone. She had already done that. and she was proud of how she had handled it. As she turned off the TV and got ready for bed, Sandra felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for a long time. She wasn't just surviving in this world, she was thriving in her own way on her own terms, and that was enough. The following morning, Sandra woke to a soft light filtering through the curtains. It was early, the sun just beginning to rise, and for a moment she simply lay in bed, allowing the quiet of the morning to fill the space. The night had been long, but she had finally found some peace, and now, the stillness of the house seemed to reflect that calm. She stretched and reached for her phone, checking the time. It was still too early for calls, but there was a message waiting for her from Keanu. She smiled as she read it again, his words offering just the right kind of encouragement she needed. There was something about his ability to be thoughtful without overthinking things. He always seemed to know what to say, when to say it, and when to just be there. It was one of the many reasons Sandra had always appreciated their friendship. After a few more minutes of stillness, Sandra finally sat up, pulling the covers off and swinging her feet onto the floor. She wasn't quite ready to face the day, but she knew it would find her soon enough. As she moved to the kitchen, she made herself a cup of coffee, the aroma filling the room. It was one of the small comforts she allowed herself, a ritual that started her day off just right. The phone buzzed again, and Sandra glanced at the screen. It was a notification from her assistant, reminding her of her schedule for the day. It was going to be another full day of work with interviews, meetings, and a few photo shoots. There was always something to do, some new task to check off the list. Sandra knew the routine by heart. She had been through it so many times before, but it never got any easier. The pressure to be perfect, to always be on, to never show any sign of weakness, it was exhausting. But as she sipped her coffee and thought about the events of the previous evening, something shifted within her. She had faced down criticism, confronted people who thought they could get away with making assumptions about her, and yet she had walked away stronger. It wasn't just about defending herself, it was about refusing to let anyone define her, and that realization made the rest of the day's challenges seem a little less daunting. The phone buzzed once more, and Sandra swiped to open the message. It was from one of the women from the gala. Sandra hadn't expected an apology, but there it was. The message was short, but it was sincere. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened last night. I was out of line, and I shouldn't have made those comments. I hope you can forgive me." Sandra read the message a few times, unsure of how to respond. She had expected the evening to pass without any resolution. She hadn't been looking for an apology, and yet here it was. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as something that didn't matter. After all, the woman hadn't truly understood what she had done. She hadn't fully grasped the impact of her words. But another part of Sandra understood something deeper. Sometimes an apology, no matter how small, was the first step toward growth. It wasn't about accepting the apology for her sake. It was about understanding that people were capable of change. After a moment's thought, Sandra typed her response. "Thank you for your message. I appreciate your apology. It's a step in the right direction, and I'm glad we can move forward." She hit send, feeling a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation that some people might have expected, but it felt right. Sandra had always believed in the power of letting go, of moving on from negativity rather than holding on to it. It was the only way to truly find peace. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Sandra got dressed for her meetings, took a few calls, and dealt with the usual round of emails and scheduling. The business side of things was never as glamorous as the red carpet moments, but it was a part of the job she couldn't escape. The public-facing stuff was always what people saw, but behind the scenes, it was a constant hustle to stay ahead of the curve, to manage expectations, and to keep everything running smoothly. But throughout it all, Sandra kept coming back to the thought that had stayed with her since the gala. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. The pressure to conform, to fit into the mold that others had set for her, had always been there, but now it felt like it was finally starting to crumble. She didn't have to chase approval. She didn't have to bend to the will of others. She could be herself unapologetically, and that felt like freedom. By mid-afternoon, Sandra found herself at the studio for an interview. The photographer was ready, the lighting was set, and the crew was bustling around her preparing for the shoot. The usual chatter filled the air as people made small talk, adjusted cameras, and prepped her wardrobe. But Sandra wasn't paying attention to any of it. Her mind was elsewhere, on the conversation from the night before, on the choices she had made, on the way she had taken control of her own narrative. She wasn't just another celebrity to be gossiped about. She was someone who had her own voice, her own power. When it was time for the interview to begin, Sandra took her seat in front of the camera. The interviewer greeted her, asking the usual questions about her career, her latest projects, and what she was passionate about. Sandra answered them all with her usual grace, but there was a new energy in her responses. She wasn't simply talking to fill the air. She was sharing herself, her real self, with the world. She spoke about her love for acting, her desire to make a difference, and how important it was to her to live authentically, no matter the circumstances. As the interview went on, Sandra felt a shift within herself. The way the interviewer responded to her was different. There was a respect, a recognition that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about the public persona she had cultivated over the years. It was about who she was as a person, the real, unpolished version of herself. And for the first time in a long while, Sandra felt seen, not just as an actress, but as a human being. After the interview wrapped, Sandra took a few moments to herself in the dressing room. She sat down, letting the weight of the day wash over her. She had come so far from where she had started, both in her career and in her personal growth. The person she was today was stronger, wiser, and more confident than the woman who had walked into that gala the night before. It wasn't just about handling the criticism or the judgment from others. It was about accepting herself, flaws and all, and not apologizing for it. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from a friend. They had been following the events of the gala on social media and had seen the way Sandra had handled the situation. "You handled it like a pro," the message read. "I'm proud of you. Keep being you." Sandra smiled at the words, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her. It wasn't about winning approval from everyone. It was about staying true to herself and having people in her life who recognized that and supported it. The day continued to unfold, each moment reinforcing the realization that Sandra didn't have to play by anyone's rules but her own. She could live her life on her own terms, regardless of what others thought or said, and that, she knew, was the most powerful thing she could do. When she finally returned home later that evening, Sandra took a moment to reflect. The events of the past 24 hours had felt like a turning point, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. She had confronted the negativity head-on, faced the judgment without flinching, and had come out stronger on the other side. She wasn't just surviving in the world of celebrity. She was thriving, embracing her truth and her power and finding peace in it. As she sat down for the night, Sandra felt a sense of calm settle over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready. She had learned that standing up for herself wasn't just about confronting others. It was about embracing her own voice, her own strength, and her own worth. And with that knowledge, Sandra knew there was nothing she couldn't face.